Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide. Chapter 4.
We arrived at the temple ahead of most of the gathering crowd. Miraculously, Jesus was still commanding crowds big enough to keep the temple elders from removing him. I kept Hannah near me. She had begged and begged to go with me, and as the days at the temple had gone on with little issue, I felt it safe enough to bring her. As early as we were, Jesus had arrived even earlier and was already in the midst of his words to the people. He was also already getting into heated discussions with the elders. They had arrived early too and were making a big show of the money that they had to give the temple. As Hannah and I found a spot to sit, Jesus walked to the front of the top step. He pointed back at those men of great influence and declared to the crowd, "Beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplace. They eat up the houses of the widows and make long, pretentious prayers." While Jesus was admonishing the men, from a secluded corner, an old woman shuffled to the same offering table. From a tiny satchel around her wrist, she pulled one small coin and placed it in the vessel. I found it rather brave of her to step up at that moment. All eyes were on that table because of Jesus' words, and now they were watching her give such a small amount. Jesus seemed to see the attention of the crowd shift to her. As he turned, he stepped towards the woman and spoke softly to her. Her face warmed with a friendly glow as Jesus put one hand around her shoulders and held her hand in his other. He again spoke to us in the crowd about how, regardless of the size of her offering, she had given more because of the amount of sacrifice it took to give. The elders that remained on the dais began trying to remind Jesus that the temple could not be adorned as it was with that one widow's mite, that it was their giving that afforded the noble stones and architecture of the structure. Jesus audibly sighed. When the men quieted down, he told them that a day would come when nothing would be left of their noble architecture, that every stone of that holy place would be torn down. The elders were in absolute shock. He had dared to threaten the place that they identified with, that they found to be the seat of their power and influence. A man from the crowd asked when all of this would happen. I could tell in his voice a sense of hopefulness, not fear. There were obviously those in the crowd that would want to see the aristocracy fall. But Jesus, in his usual oblique way of speaking, began referencing false teachers and wars and persecution. He talked about how families would turn on each other and how some may die for following him. He went on to describe how this mighty city would fall and that we would be running for the hills of Judea for fear of death. In all of this, he continually sprinkled the words, "Do not fear." He talked about how it would happen to fulfill the story he had come to write. Just at that moment, I began to question my decision to bring Hannah to hear him speak, but his words took a turn. Amidst all the horrors that he predicted, he said the Son of Man would intercede, triumphantly returning on a cloud and robed in power and glory. I looked down at Hannah, and her eyes were alight with a fire that I had never seen. She wasn't afraid at all of what Jesus had said. I could see that she was totally enraptured by the thought of Jesus coming to save us. Oh, the faith of children, her ability to see beyond the fear and the anxiety and just see Jesus. I had something to learn from her. Perhaps we all did. Jesus closed by reminding us to follow him and to stay watchful and pray, to understand that we will not go through these things on our own, but if we could endure them together, we will see him set everything right in due time. Hannah and I watched him leave the temple dais as the sun was growing heavy towards the west. Hannah turned to me and asked me how soon we needed to pray over all that was to come. I looked at my sweet daughter, and I looked at the crowd of followers, and Romans, and temple elders, and with a heavy sigh of determination, told her there was no better time than the present. There in the middle of the square, as the crowds were dispersing to their homes and lives, I grabbed my daughter's hands and began to pray. Father in heaven, you have promised to see us through the darkest of days. No matter how shadowed the valley, your presence goes before us. As we walk in the faith that only you can sustain, help us to see the path that you have laid out for us. Protect us and strengthen us for the days to come. Father, let me not be misdirected by my fears for our future. For you have promised us a future and a hope for those that believe your word. We believe your word and trust it and find peace that is beyond normal understanding. Father, let your will be done in our lives, that your will may be done here on earth to the furthest corners. With our eyes closed in prayer, Hannah and I had not noticed the group of people that had gathered around us. Arms raised and heads bowed, they too were praying and worshiping with us. When I began that prayer, I knew it could cost me everything. That Hannah and I could be found there alone in that square praying and seen as dissidents or traitors. But there around us stood a circle of followers of Jesus. I knew none of them personally, but we were united in prayer and in Jesus. No, Jesus was not safe. But for the first time, I truly knew that he was good.
I waited at home for hours, but had not seen or heard from Jacob since we had it out at the temple square. I'd relayed all the details of what happened to Father, and he praised me for my quick and decisive actions. In light of the decisions Jacob was making, Father said he was on the verge of renouncing Jacob as his son. He could not continue to let him jeopardize everything Father had worked for, including my marriage to Havah. But I begged Father to have patience for Jacob, and I reminded him of all the times Jacob had done stupid things in the past and eventually turned himself around. As incensed as I was about what he had done, estranging him from the family was a drastic move. Father promised nothing other than that one way or another, this Jesus situation would be handled. Then, to my shock, he asked me to accompany him to the temple. He said that he wanted the other elders to see his eldest son had not been deceived by the convoluted words of Jesus and his followers. So I was very excited. I found my newest tunic and sandals and proudly walked beside my father as we ascended the stairs of the temple. And then there was Jesus yet again, already talking about his latest topic of controversy. Father and the other men were placing their offerings at the table, as they always did at this time of day. I watched, knowing that it was a great sense of pride for my father that he could give at the same level of some of these men. But, of course, Jesus had to go and stir that up too. He dared to claim that my father's giving wasn't anything more than a show, that some old lady with one mite to give was a better giver than they were. Despite their effort to remind him that it was their money that afforded the finest stones for the building of the temple, Jesus continued his ranting into a level of absurdity, even blasphemy. He was daring to threaten the temple with destruction, plainly stating for all the square to hear that he would tear it down to rubble. That was one of the moments that I found that the Romans were utterly useless. They just stood there in their expensive armor and arrogant attitudes, almost laughing at the trouble he was causing. Outraged, I looked at Father and he whispered to me that the elders were going to be meeting tonight to come up with a plan. They'd heard of a possible dissension in his ranks and planned to use it to their advantage. Maybe they could find an inside man to help bring him down. Tonight would be the beginning of the end. I couldn't help but hope that with Jesus taken care of, Jacob would return to his family in penance. As the hour grew late, I reminded Father that tonight was Passover and that we needed to return home. Still entrenched in the secret planning, Father told me to return home and that he would soon follow. He and the other elders needed to discuss further plans. So, I bid them farewell and began the journey home. As I walked, I began thinking over the events of the last few days. With the appearance of Jesus in Jerusalem, our family had been utterly torn apart. What started as just a local nuisance had become a continual source of embarrassment and shame. I mean, one man rides in on a donkey and shakes the very foundations of everything my father had worked so hard to build up for himself and for our family. taking away a loving and faithful son, discrediting Father's work at the temple in front of the very people he served, threatening everything I stood to gain at the very precipice of my independence, sending Mother into tears of fear every time something new occurred to shake up her very stable and secure existence. How could that ever be what a savior was meant to do? How could Jacob want to follow that man who had done so much hurt to us?
The streets were quiet that night, all the Jews held up in their homes celebrating yet another religious holiday. If you listened well enough, you could hear the voices of their matrons carried in the wind, a song of mourning and thanksgiving. How could they continue to revere a God that had just put them through so much was beyond me. I appreciated the quiet as I sat at my desk, considering what steps to take in regard to this prophet of theirs. I had connections with Roman leadership within the city. They, like I, would not have much patience for the continued disruption of city commerce and overall peace. It would only take some prodding to get them to act where the Jewish leadership would not. But I must word my argument well. I must approach the right person at the right time. Perhaps tonight, as the Jews were otherwise occupied, would be advantageous. In the dark of the newly risen moon, I informed Marcus I was leaving and set out to one particular house in the city. My late arrival might not necessarily be welcome to begin with, but once I told them what I had to say.
The camp was very subdued. There was an air of foreboding over every conversation around the fire. Jesus and his men, as they often did, had retreated to their quiet place further up the mount. The night grew long as they delayed their return. I sat with Mary to keep her company. I could see on her face that she was very scared, but she did not share with me why. Hannah had drifted off early in the evening, completely worn out from all that we had experienced during the day, and her stomach full from our Passover celebration. She was curled up with some of the other young children in our tent, fast asleep. The peace on her face as she rested would always be a balm to my often troubled heart. As Mary and I sat there occasionally chatting, often praying, a man came running from the direction that Jesus and his men had walked. As he drew closer, I could tell it was one of Jesus' men. He was panicked. As other men around the campfire rose to intercept him, I could only hear a few words drift our direction. Something about Judas and Jesus and the elders. Then his words quickly turned into incoherent sobs as the men turned to inform us that Jesus had been taken. Mary and I were both in shock. The time had come. He had warned us, and we were foolish to have thought anything otherwise. Our Savior was in the hands of those people whose minds were set on his death. It occurred to me that these supposedly devout Jewish men had spent the time of their Passover celebration conspiring as to how to catch Jesus at just the right time. Somehow, they knew he would be alone with his men at this time in the evening and not in the encampment, where the sheer number of his followers would prevent them from getting to him. How did they know? Our people did everything to ensure his protection. Sitting there with Mary, I did not have to hear it from the disciple to know that someone amongst them had betrayed Jesus. After all he had done for those of us that had faithfully followed, someone close had sold him out. Mary and I knew there was no going back from this night. Nothing would be the same as the sun rose tomorrow morning. Our Savior would spend tonight in chains. What were we going to do now?
Passover celebration came and went, and Father had not returned at our home. Mother was beside herself and was barely able to make it through the rites of the Passover ceremony. Once the meal was completed, me having taken Father's role just to get through it properly, Mother sent me out into the dark streets to find him. She just knew something had happened to him. I knew in my mind that Jacob was out there somewhere too. In such a short time, Mother had seen two men she loved dearly not return to her home. I felt a burden to hold her and our home up like never before. When would this insanity end? As I combed the streets for any sign of Father or the elders, it it occurred to me to visit the high priest dwelling adjacent to the temple in the courtyard. Rounding the corner into the square, there was an unusual amount of activity as people bustled from one campfire to another. Voices seemed to carry information of great interest from one group to the next. I looked over to see lights still shining in the windows of the high priest's home. As I walked up to the entrance, a group of Jews were huddled around a small fire. One seemed familiar, and his face would not be a coincidence here if I was beginning to understand just what Father was embroiled in. I locked eyes with this man and asked, "Are you the man named Peter, that is the follower and disciple of the so-called prophet Jesus?" The man looked at me with tears in his eyes, all more looking like the gray-faced and sickly man that crowded the outside gates of our city, and he screamed at me that he did not know who this Jesus was that I referred to. I was shocked at his response, and I stood there watching as he quickly rose and ran from the square. The people that sat with him around the fire spoke nothing more and tucked their chins into their chests, which was a clear sign that I would learn no more here. So I moved closer to the doors of the high priest's home, knowing now that my father was inside. The guards at the door would not let me enter. Wordlessly, they blocked my access with their huge frames. But I had drawn close enough that I could hear the sound of sandaled feet raining blows on a broken body. But there were no screams, just the grunts of air being ripped from a man's lungs. Through the door, I hear my father's voice among the group.
"Prophesy, son of man, who is it that hits you?"
The anger in my father's voice took my breath away. Standing there in silence, the sun began to break over the massive stone facades of the houses in the square. Just faintly, I hear a cock crow to herald the coming dawn.
A Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide, is written and produced by Kelly Duke with editing and oversight by Philip Larson. Vocal talents provided by Brett Bauer, Tony Gregory, Randy Kemp, and Mary C. Bruce. Theme music written by Danny Lee, Andy Dixon, Scott Garnan, and Stephen Gray, and performed by the West Metro Worship Collective. Background instrumentals provided by Higher Power. Discussion and insight questions by Ryan Abernathy. Sound editing by Ron Duke.